Welcome to this trip through one of the most horrible cases in history. Today, we'll go into the dark parts of the Appalachian Mountains, where two women left a mark that time has never been able to completely erase. This video is a work of fiction made just for fun. Any similarities to real people, living or dead, are purely coincidental. There was a private estate in the mountains of West Virginia that few people dared to visit. The mist danced between rocky peaks, and the valleys held old secrets. In the late 1800s, dirt roads barely connected rural areas, and the law didn't often reach the most remote areas. Nora and Abigail were cousins who grew up together in those harsh lands. They learned early on that being strong wasn't enough to stay alive. It required cleverness, calmness, and the ability to do whatever was needed without thinking twice. The cousins' land was in a good spot near one of the few trails that went through that part of the Appalachians. People traveling alone often came through, looking for shelter or directions to the nearest towns. People all over the country knew about Southern hospitality, but in that house, the friendliness hid something much worse. The two women had a strange reputation among the few neighbors who lived miles away. People thought they were strange, quiet, and not dangerous. No one knew what really happened when the doors of that house closed. County records show that Nora was a few months older than the other girl. She had dark hair and piercing eyes that seemed to look at everyone who crossed her path. Abigail looked more fragile, but those who knew her best knew that her fragility was just a carefully crafted mask. They made a deadly pair, with each one almost perfectly matching the other's skills. There have always been stories in the Appalachian region about people living alone and being very self-sufficient, but what happened on that property was much more than just needing to stay alive in the mountains. For years, people in the small neighboring villages spread rumors in the taverns and markets. Some travelers who passed through the area never made it to their final destination. Families waited for letters that were never sent, and merchants left with their goods and disappeared like smoke in the morning mist. But back then, when communication was bad and distances seemed impossible to cross, it was easy to blame these disappearances on the area's natural dangers, like bears, cliffs, sudden storms, and highway robbers. The mountains always had their own ways of taking lives back. This ability to hide in plain sight is what made Nora and Abigail so dangerous. They didn't seem dangerous, and they didn't make anyone suspicious right away. They were just two women living alone in the mountains, trying to stay alive like many other families in the area. But behind this normal-looking front, there was a carefully planned pattern of events that happened every time a lone traveler knocked on the door and asked for help or a place to stay for the night. At first glance, there was something strange about the cousins' house that not many people noticed. It was on a curve in the path where people naturally slowed down because they were tired from the steep climb that came before that part. Nora would show up on the porch at just the right time, offering fresh water from the well or a place to rest before continuing the journey. Many people gladly accepted the invitation because the hospitality seemed real. Abigail had a different part to play in this carefully planned situation. She stayed inside the house, making tea or something to eat. This made the visitors feel at home and normal. The cousins were genuinely interested in the travelers' stories about where they were going and what business they were doing. Someone who just likes to talk gathered information in a way that was very subtle, but every detail was mentally filed away and judged for how useful it was. The cousins needed one thing for their activities: complete isolation, which the mountainous area gave them. The closest neighbor lived a long way away, and the deep valleys and steep slopes covered in thick pine trees made it hard for sound to travel. In the winter of 1891, when snowstorms made the trails almost impossible, the property became an island, cut off from the rest of the world. During these months, the cousins felt safest to do what they wanted without worrying. Historical records from the area show an interesting pattern. Merchants who carried valuable goods across the mountains often went missing during the colder months, when few people were willing to risk the dangerous trails. The families of these men eventually got vague news about mountain accidents, deadly falls, or never heard from them again. It was impossible to find out what happened to these people in the end back then, when there were no modern ways to communicate or investigate. Nora knew a lot about the mountains that surrounded the property. She knew every ravine, every cave that was hard to find, and every old trail that went through the thick forest. Families who lived in Appalachia passed this knowledge down from generation to generation, but Nora used it in ways that her ancestors could never have imagined. The mountains became her quiet friends, keeping secrets that even time couldn't fully reveal. Abigail had skills that worked perfectly with those of her cousin. She knew about the herbs and plants that grew in the area, which was something that many Appalachian women knew about because they used natural medicine to treat injuries and illnesses. But you could use this information in other ways and for other things. A kind tea could have ingredients that make you very sleepy, confused, and weak. When combined with the property's isolation, it became a very powerful tool. The cousins' daily lives followed a strict schedule. During the day, they acted like regular women who worked on their property. They took care of some chickens, worked on a small vegetable garden, and fixed fences. People who walked by would only see two women trying to stay alive in the mountains. But when night fell and the shadows grew longer among the pine trees, the true nature of that house became clear to the few unlucky people who had accepted the invitation to stay. The seasons came and went, and people still came to the property from time to time. In the spring of 1893, more people started using the trails. Merchants and adventurers took advantage of the nicer weather to cross the mountains. The cousins had a good sense of who to let in and who to leave alone when someone knocked on the door. Each knock on the door was a chance. Their system was simple but effective. They gave special treatment to lone travelers who were carrying valuable or interesting items. They got the best seats, the biggest meals, and the longest, most interesting conversations. People who were in groups, or who obviously had nothing of value, were politely told which way to go and then sent on their way. There was no need to take a risk, only cold calculation and patience. Abigail was very good at getting people to trust her. Visitors let their guard down completely because of her soft voice and kind demeanor. She talked about how hard life was in the mountains, how lonely it was to live alone, and how nice it was to have company, even for a short time. These talks made travelers feel safe and close to each other, as if they were with friends. That feeling was exactly what made everything work so well. Nora watched in the meantime. Her eyes took in every motion, every gesture, and every detail that could be important. She saw where the visitors kept their money, what kind of weapons they had, and if they were really alone, or if someone was waiting for them in a nearby village. All of this information was quickly put together to make a full picture of the situation. And then, when the time was right, usually after dinner when the trip's fatigue started to set in, things went as planned. For a simple house, the property had some interesting architectural details. The basement was surprisingly deep because it was carved right into the rock of the mountain. The thick stone walls kept the temperature the same all year, which was great for storing preserved foods and other things that needed to be kept out of sight. The only way into this basement was through a trapdoor in the kitchen that was cleverly hidden under a heavy rug. Winters in the Appalachian Mountains were especially harsh. Snow would pile up for weeks, and the wind would howl through the peaks like a living thing. During these times, the property was cut off from the rest of the world. No one would come by unexpectedly, and no neighbors would come by to visit. The cousins had the perfect amount of time and privacy to do some things that needed to be done. The woods around the property were thick and hard to get through in many places. There were steep cliffs, deep ravines covered in thick plants, and streams that rushed in rapids during the spring thaw. Nora knew every inch of that land, including spots where the soil was soft enough to work, where the roots of old trees grew in a way that made natural hiding places, and where the earth just swallowed whatever was put in it without leaving any trace. The cousins' daily lives followed a pattern that didn't change very often. They would get up at dawn, when the fog was still thick in the valleys and the cold mountain air came through the cracks in their wooden house. Nora would start the fire in the stove while Abigail made the coffee, and they would start their day like any other family in the Appalachian Mountains. But there was a big difference between them and their distant neighbors. Everything they did, from gestures to activities to decisions, had a purpose that went beyond just staying alive. During the summer, when the trails were busier and the heat made travel easier, more people came to the property. These included peddlers with fabrics and tools, hunters looking for valuable furs, gamblers running away from debts in faraway cities, and adventurers dreaming of opportunities in the West. Everyone brought their stories, their things, their money, and their plans, and the cousins listened to everything with what seemed like real interest, soaking up information like a sponge soaks up water. Abigail had become very good at reading people over the years. She could quickly tell who was telling the truth about their resources and who was lying. She looked at the hands of people who came to see her, looking for calluses that showed they did a lot of hard work, or the lack of them that showed they lived a more comfortable life. She paid attention to how nice their clothes were, even when they were dirty from traveling. She listened to how they talked, paying attention to whether they used big words or simple ones, and whether they had an accent from a certain part of the country. All of these facts gave a full picture of who that person was and what they could do. The house was like a living thing that changed to meet the cousins' needs. Every room had a purpose, and every piece of furniture was placed in a way that made sense. The comfortable chairs in the living room, which were near the fireplace, helped make the first welcoming atmosphere. The kitchen was in a good spot between the living room and the rest of the house, so Abigail could make her special meals there. There was a narrow wooden staircase that creaked under any weight that led to the bedrooms upstairs. And then there was the cellar, which was carved out of the living rock of the mountain and was as cold and quiet as a grave. Nora had a strange connection with the mountains around her. She didn't see them as threats or problems. She saw them as loyal friends who would never let her down. She knew trails that had been forgotten about for decades, secret paths that smugglers used during the war, and caves that were hidden behind curtains of ivy and moss. She had learned this over the years by carefully exploring the area and taking long hikes alone, during which she mentally mapped every detail of the land. The mountains kept their secrets better than any vault made by people. The closest towns were days' ride away on horseback, and they didn't talk to each other very often. A man could leave one place with the goal of getting to another and never show up. No one would know where to look or when to start worrying. It was impossible to keep track of every traveler who crossed the Appalachians because of the long distances and dangerous terrain. The cousins learned how to use this natural anonymity to their advantage. In the fall of 1894, when the tree's leaves turned the hillsides into a patchwork of gold and red, something interesting happened. 3 men walked through the property, and Nora made the choice to just give them directions and let them go. Later, Abigail asked why they made this choice, saying that they looked like they were carrying valuable things. But Nora explained her reasoning. 3 men traveling together meant 3 families who would have questions, 3 sets of expectations about when they would arrive and how they would talk to each other. The risk was too high for the reward. This discipline, this ability to control their impulses and think ahead, is what kept the cousins running their business without anyone noticing for so long. The seasons went on and on. In the spring, the snow melted and new travelers came. In the summer, the trails were busy with people and things to do. In the fall, the mountains were painted with bright colors, but travel slowed down. In the winter, the property was completely cut off from the outside world, and there was only the wind and distant wolves breaking the silence. The cousins had learned to work with the natural rhythms of the area, and each season had its own pros and cons. People in the faraway villages had mixed feelings about the cousins. Some people thought they were brave women who chose to live alone in the mountains, going against the social norms of the time that said unmarried women should live with male relatives. Some people thought they were just weird, maybe a little strange, but not dangerous. Some people, though, felt a strange unease when they heard about the remote property, as if some primal instinct told them something was wrong there. The things that the cousins sometimes had were explained in simple and convincing ways. Someone said that a nice pocket watch was a gift from a distant uncle, and that fine fabrics had been bought from a peddler who had passed through the area months before. The new tools were the result of careful saving and a rare trip to a bigger town. No one really questioned these explanations because, to be honest, no one paid enough attention to see patterns or inconsistencies. It was too hard to worry about what was going on with neighbors who lived miles away in the mountains. Abigail became very interested in documents over the years. She picked up papers that people had left behind, like unsent letters, receipts from business deals, scribbled maps, and personal notes. Like trophies in a private collection, these papers were carefully stored in a wooden box in the attic. During long winter nights, she would sometimes take them out and read them again. She would imagine the lives of the people who had lived in that house and the futures they would never reach. Nora, on the other hand, was more interested in practical things. She cared about things that could be used or sold, like money, jewelry, good weapons, and tools that would last. But there was one thing she liked more than anything else: maps. Maps of the area that show different paths, water sources, settlements far away, and trade routes. Each map added to her already vast knowledge of the area, giving her more mental control over the huge area of mountains and valleys. It was interesting to see how the two cousins interacted with each other, but not many people got to see it. They didn't often disagree on big choices because they had learned to communicate almost telepathically over the years. A quick look could say a lot. A small hand gesture could mean yes or be careful. They didn't need to talk to each other very often. They had that silent language that only very close people can develop. In the spring of 1896, something strange happened. A young woman came to the property by herself, which was very rare at the time. She said that she was running away from an arranged marriage and wanted to start over in the West, where no one knew her. Nora and Abigail were as welcoming as always, but this time something was different. Maybe it was the support women gave each other in a world run by men. Maybe it was because they saw a rebellious spirit in someone else that was like their own. Whatever the reason, the traveler was unharmed after 2 days of intense conversation. She had extra food and clear directions to the next town with her. This event taught us something important about the cousins. They weren't just blind killers who acted on impulse. There were rules, even though they weren't written down. There were lines they wouldn't cross, places they would stay away from, and people they would let go. Being very picky about who they let in was one of the things that kept them from being caught. There was no clear pattern among the victims, and investigators couldn't find any common trait. Each case seemed to be its own thing, and there were many ways to get into trouble in the dangerous Appalachian Mountains. The mountains stayed the same for years, quietly watching everything that happened in their shadow. The cousins' land had become a part of the landscape, just like the pine trees that had been there for hundreds of years around the clearing where the house was built. The roof needed constant repairs because of the heavy winter snowstorms, and the wooden planks had darkened over time and with the weather. But the building was still strong, and so were the two women who lived there. In the summer of 1897, the area went through an unusual drought that made many streams into small streams. This made things interesting for travelers who were crossing the mountains because only the locals knew where to find reliable sources of drinking water. The cousins' property had a deep well that never dried up. It was dug years ago by a previous owner who chose that spot because there was an underground water table there. During those dry months, this well drew in travelers who were in need, bringing more people than usual to the cousins' door. Nora looked at the rise in traffic with careful interest. Every thirsty visitor was a chance, but also a bigger risk. More people meant more possible questions, and more connections that would need to be carefully handled. During those hot summer nights, she and Abigail talked for a long time about their choices and how to move forward. The answer was simple. Moderation was the most important thing. They would really help a lot of travelers by giving them water and directions without expecting anything in return. This would help them build a reputation as honest Samaritans. Only when the situation was very good would they act in their own best interests. During that time, Abigail started to pay even more attention to the little things. She could tell which travelers had family waiting for them, which ones were all alone in the world, and which ones had letters of introduction for jobs in faraway cities. It was like putting together a complicated puzzle with these pieces of information. One wrong decision or hasty choice could bring down the whole operation, which took years to build up. Over time, the house had developed its own mood. The wooden floors creaked in certain spots, making a sound map that the cousins were very familiar with. They could move without making a sound when they needed to, stepping only on the points that didn't make a sound. The thick walls were built to withstand the harsh winters in the mountains, but they also had the benefit of blocking out any noise from inside, making the house feel like a capsule cut off from the outside world. The windows were small and placed in such a way that they let in light, but kept the inside dark most of the day. Nora learned more and more about the mountains. She went on regular trips, and sometimes she would be gone for days at a time while Abigail took care of the property by herself. She found new places, tried out different routes, and found natural landmarks that could be helpful on these trips. For example, she found a very deep ravine covered in thick vegetation, an area of soft soil hidden by huge ferns, and an ancient stone circle that may have been used by native people hundreds of years ago, but was now completely forgotten. She mentally filed away each new piece of information, adding it to the mental map she already had. The seasons kept going around and around, each one bringing its own problems and chances. The fall of 1898 was especially memorable because there was a lot of nuts and wild berries to pick, which brought hunters and gatherers to the woods around the property. Some of these visitors would stop to ask the cousins if they could hunt on their land, which was a common way to be polite back then. Nora always said yes with a smile, which made her look like a kind and generous landowner. This reputation was useful because it made things seem normal, which made it less likely that people would be suspicious in the future. At the same time, Abigail got better at cooking and learning about medicinal plants. She had a herb garden next to the house with basil, thyme, sage, and other common plants. In the back, though, she had more private beds where she grew less common plants with more interesting properties. An old woman who had lived in the mountains decades before Abigail learned about these plants from a healer who had taught her the secrets of herbs when she was a child. They had fully absorbed this knowledge, expanded it through careful experimentation, and turned it into a precise tool. The cousins took care of their relationship with their distant neighbors. They went to nearby villages from time to time, always together and always pretending to be normal. They bought things, talked to the merchants politely, and maybe even went to church if they were in town on a Sunday. These regular but spaced-out visits kept them connected to the community without making people wonder why they were alone. People thought they were hard-working women who liked being alone in the mountains. This was a strange choice, but not one that raised any red flags. The cousins had time to think about everything they had built during the harsh winter of 1899, when the snow piled up to the windows and the outside world almost stopped existing. They sat in front of the fireplace, sharing the warmth of the fire and the peaceful silence of people who don't need to talk all the time. They didn't have to say anything to each other about how much they had accomplished. They were completely free. Their financial security was assured by the resources they had built up over the years, and their secret was safe because the mountains hid it better than any confessional. The Appalachian region changed in small but noticeable ways at the turn of the century. Railroads started to grow, linking villages that used to take weeks to get to. When the telegraph came to big cities, it changed how quickly people could talk to each other. The world was slowly becoming more modern, but in the deep mountains where Nora and Abigail lived, time seemed to move at its own pace, unaffected by the changes happening in the rest of the country. The trails stayed the same. The valleys stayed as isolated as ever, and life went on as it always had. The cousins watched these changes with a mix of interest and caution. Nora, in particular, knew that the world was getting smaller, and that the distances that had once kept them safe were getting smaller too. But she also knew that it would still take decades for these changes to really reach the most remote parts of the mountains. As long as they stayed alert and changed their plans as needed, they had enough time to keep doing things the way they always had. In the spring of 1901, a very interesting person came to the property. He was a middle-aged man who said he was a writer traveling through the mountains to find stories for a book about life in the Appalachians. He had notebooks full of notes, drawings of landscapes, and pictures of people he had met on his journey. Nora knew right away that this person could be dangerous. A writer was someone who listened, asked questions, and remembered things. He was welcomed warmly, but not too closely, stayed only long enough to rest, and then continued on his way with a simple story about two brave women living in the mountains. Abigail later said that it was getting harder to judge the visitors. People were changing, getting smarter, traveling more, and learning more about the world outside of their own communities. The people who were passing through the property were no longer just illiterate hunters or simple peddlers. People who had been educated before were starting to show up. They had connections in many cities and expected letters to get to their destinations, and for their absence to be noticed and looked into. They had to change the way they did things because of this new reality. The two women talked about and improved their methods for weeks. They agreed that they needed to be even more picky and patient. The time between their actions would have to get longer, and the choices would have to get better. But they also knew that because they had built up their resources over the years, they didn't have to act as often. They had money saved up and valuable things hidden in secret places all over the property and in the mountains nearby. They could let a lot of chances go by because they were only looking for the best ones. That summer was surprisingly calm. Not many people traveled along the trail, maybe because of rumors about bear problems in the area or because other routes were becoming more popular. During this quiet time, Nora and Abigail worked on the property to make it better. They fixed the roof by bringing new boards from the nearest village. They made the fences around the property stronger. They cleaned and organized the basement, which was a space carved out of rock that served many useful purposes. The house had never looked better. Abigail became interested in the weather patterns in the area during this time of relative peace. She carefully noted when the first snows fell, when the spring thaws began, and which months had the worst storms. This information was obviously useful in real life because it let her guess when the property would be less busy or when it would be more likely to get visitors. But there was also something almost scientific about the way she did things, as if she were writing down the very breath of the mountains. Nora, on the other hand, started drawing detailed maps on paper to turn the information she had in her head into something real. She drew lines on the map to show paths, marked important places, and wrote down the rough distances between them. These maps never showed where the property was, and they also didn't show the most secret places she knew. They were intentionally incomplete, which made them good for basic navigation, but not for anyone who wanted to put together a full picture of the region's geography. The real secrets stayed in her mind. The cousins spent weeks getting the house ready for winter as autumn came with its usual burst of colors. They cut enough firewood to last for months, put away canned food, and made sure that all the windows were properly sealed against the cold. They did it every year, and they did it well because they had done it so many times before. Each person knew exactly what her job was without having to talk about it or coordinate it. During one of these afternoons of getting ready, something strange happened. A very old man, probably over 70, came walking down the path. He was obviously sick, had a fever, and was confused. Nora and Abigail brought him inside, made a cozy bed by the fireplace, and made herbal tea that really helped him feel better. For 3 days they took care of him with real care, lowering his fever, feeding him healthy soup, and keeping him warm and comfortable. On the 4th day, he was well enough to thank them a lot and go on his way, giving them the little money he had as a thank you for taking care of him. They politely said no. This event showed something important about the cousins' complicated personalities. They weren't monsters who didn't care about other people and did bad things just to hurt others. They were people who could show real compassion in some situations, but they had their own moral code that made it clear what kinds of situations and people were bad. An old, sick man was neither a threat nor an opportunity. He was just someone who needed basic help, and in that case, helping him was the obvious thing to do. Human psychology is very complicated, and it doesn't always fit into simple categories of good and bad. People can hold on to very strange contradictions in their personalities and separate parts of themselves in ways that may seem impossible to those who are not them. Nora and Abigail were great examples of how people can split their minds and be kind and cruel, generous and predatory all at the same time, depending on the situation. The winter of 1902 came on with a force that few people in the mountains could remember. In early November, the snow started to fall and didn't stop for weeks. The winds howled through the valleys like angry animals, making the snow pile up into huge mounds. The cousins' estate was cut off from the rest of the world, like an island of life in a white frozen sea. For those months, the only people Nora and Abigail had to talk to were each other, the sound of the fire crackling in the hearth, and the deep silence that only snow can make. They didn't mind being so alone. There was something comforting about knowing for sure that no one would come, knock on the door, or break up their routines. During the day, they did important household chores, read old books they had collected over the years, and played cards by candlelight when it got too dark too early. They talked about the past, the future, and the changes they saw in the world around them. They talked for a long time and went on, which is something that only people who are very close to each other can do. Abigail took advantage of that alone time to sort through her papers and documents. She put them on the kitchen table and sorted them into groups that only made sense to her. Love letters that were never sent, business contracts that would never be fulfilled, and maps that led to places that would never be reached. Each piece of paper had pieces of broken lives and dreams that had been left behind. She read them with a feeling that could be called sad, which was strange given how she had been involved in those interruptions. Nora was quietly interested in this ritual. She had never fully understood why Abigail was so interested in these papers, but she thought it was a harmless quirk. Everyone had their own way of thinking about what they did and why they made the choices they did. These papers were more than trophies or keepsakes for Abigail. They were character studies, windows into people's souls, and lessons about human nature that she learned and took to heart. When spring finally came and the snow melted, revealing the trails again, Both cousins felt a mix of relief and something like reluctance. The quiet of winter was comforting because it was always the same. With the arrival of warmer weather came the return of choices, risks, and variables that needed to be handled. But it also brought back the energy that comes with spring, the feeling that new possibilities were opening up. The main trail that ran close to the property was showing signs of wear and tear after the harsh winter. There were trees in the way that had fallen. Rocks that weren't tightly packed had rolled down and made things harder. The thaw had made the streams bigger, and they had washed away whole parts of the dirt road. Nora spent weeks clearing and fixing the path, not because she wanted to help, but because she had to. Travelers needed a passable trail to keep going through the area, and travelers were the whole reason the cousins built the operation in the first place. Nora had a lot of time to think and watch while she worked on fixing the trail. She saw how the mountains changed a little bit each year, with some landmarks disappearing and new ones appearing. The old dead tree she used as a landmark had finally fallen during a winter storm. A small landslide made a rocky outcrop that used to be hidden by plants completely visible. She had to keep updating her mental map of the area because of these changes in nature. In the meantime, Abigail focused on the herb garden. Some of the flower beds were damaged by the heavy snow, and a few of the plants didn't make it through the harsh winter. She spent days replanting, moving things around, and trying out different types of plants that might be better able to handle the cold. She had an endless amount of patience in her work. She was willing to try and fail and try again until she got the results she wanted. She was patient in all parts of her life, even the hardest ones. Summer brought a new wave of travelers through the mountains. Many people talked about the harsh winter they had just gone through, sharing stories of storms that stood out and problems they had solved. The cousins politely listened to these stories and sometimes shared their own stories of being alone. These talks made shallow but important connections, making them feel like they were part of the larger community of the area, even though they lived so far away from it all. Nora made a big choice that summer. She told Abigail that they needed to think about the future more seriously. They weren't getting any younger, and the mountains were hard on people whose strength started to fade. They needed to make sure they had enough resources for the future, when they might not be able to do the hard physical work that living in the mountains required. This meant they had to be even more strategic and choosy, making the most of every action they took. Abigail completely agreed with this. She had also been thinking about getting older, how her reflexes weren't as quick as they used to be, and how some physical tasks were harder than they used to be. They set new rules for what they could do, a mental list of things that had to be done before any action could be taken. The person had to be completely alone, with no obvious ties that would lead to investigations. They had to bring a lot of supplies with them, enough to make the extra risk worth it. The weather had to be perfect, and they had to have enough time to take care of all their needs afterwards. These new rules were so strict that it could take months for the right chance to come along. But at this point in their lives, the cousins had agreed that quality was more important than quantity. A well-done action was worth more than a lot of missed chances because of rushing or bad judgment. Their patience, which had always been their best quality, was now absolutely necessary. Once again, autumn had come, and the bright colors on the hillsides made the mountains look almost magical. People from the cities started to visit the area from time to time to enjoy the natural beauty of the Appalachians. This was a fairly new change that happened because the railroads made the area easier to get to. Nora and Abigail watched these city visitors with a mix of interest and disgust. They walked along the trails in clothes that weren't right for them, taking pictures with heavy, expensive cameras of things that were just part of everyday life for the cousins. These tourists were a whole different type of visitor, and the cousins quickly made it clear that they would be left alone no matter what else was going on. Tourists had plans, hotel reservations, and people who were supposed to meet them on certain days. They were the kind of people who would get unwanted attention if something happened. So, they were politely told where to go, maybe given a glass of fresh water from the well, and then sent on their way right away. The years went on, and with them came changes that even the most distant mountains couldn't completely avoid. The start of the new century brought changes in technology and society that slowly made their way to even the most remote parts of the Appalachian. Roads got better over time, postal services got more reliable, and things that used to take weeks to get done could now be done in days. The world was getting smaller, more connected, and more open, which meant that the area where Nora and Abigail worked was getting smaller. While the snow fell nonstop outside, the cousins talked for hours about what the future would be like. They sat by the fire, drank a bottle of wine they had saved for special occasions, and talked openly for the first time about the possibility of closing their business for good. It wasn't easy to think about making that choice. That way of life had shaped their lives for so long that it was hard to picture anything else. But they both knew that they had to think about the possibility. Abigail made some good points during these talks. They had saved up enough money to live comfortably for the rest of their lives without having to take any more risks. They had money stashed away in different places, like on the property and in secret spots in the mountains. They had valuable things that they could sell over time without anyone noticing. The land itself was worth something, and if they ever wanted to leave the area, they could sell it and start over somewhere else, maybe in a small town where no one knew them and they could just be two middle-aged women living peacefully. Nora paid close attention, but she had her own things to think about. She said that stopping suddenly could be just as dangerous as going on forever. If they suddenly left the area or the property without saying why, it could raise questions. People would notice, ask questions, and guess. It was important to have a well-thought-out exit plan that didn't make anyone curious. They could start by talking about a made-up sister who lives in another state and needs to be taken care of. This could lead to a story about why they had to leave. The two women worked on this story of a possible escape for months, adding details that made it believable. During visits to nearby villages, they casually brought up this made-up sister, which made merchants and distant neighbors believe she was real. It was like planting a seed that could grow over time until it was ready to be picked when needed. They had learned to be patient over the years, and now they were using that skill to plan their eventual retreat. As it always did in the Appalachians, spring came back with a bang. The streams turned into raging torrents as the ice melted, and the forest came back to life in a burst of bright green. Nora went back to exploring the mountains, but this time for a different reason. She started going to the different hideouts they had made over the years to see if they were still standing, and if the things they had stored there were still in good shape. It was a detailed list of everything they had collected over the years, a record of decades of work. For her part, Abigail started the difficult task of putting her collection of papers together. The ink was fading, and the paper was getting brittle on a lot of the older papers. She had to make the hard choice to get rid of most of the collection. She burned the papers in the fireplace on lonely nights when Nora was out on her expeditions. It was like saying goodbye to a memory, a story, or a piece of the past with each piece of paper that burned. But it had to be done. The less proof there was, the safer her future would be. An unexpected event in the summer forced the cousins to deal with things they would rather not have to. A man came to the property in a uniform that showed he worked for a surveying company. He politely told them that they were using new scientific methods to map the area, which would make the maps more accurate than the ones that were already there. If they would let him, he needed to measure some things on the cousins' land. They agreed to the request, even though they didn't want to, because they didn't want to look suspicious. Nora and Abigail were on guard but friendly the whole time the surveyor was in the area. They were polite and offered basic hospitality, but they didn't want to talk for long. They watched closely where he went, what places he looked at, and what notes he wrote down. Fortunately, his work focused mainly on the geological and topographical features of the region, not on the specific details of the property. The cousins felt uneasy after he left, because they knew that the world was changing in ways that would make their way of life harder to keep up with. That event pushed them to make a choice they had been putting off. Nora and Abigail officially agreed that the things that had been a big part of their lives for so long needed to come to an end. Not right away, but over the next few years in a planned way. They made a mental deadline. By the end of the decade, they would be fully retired and living as two normal women in a big city where they could blend in with the crowds. This choice made me feel both relieved and sad at the same time. Knowing that an end was near and that they wouldn't have to stay on guard all the time was freeing. But it was also sad to realize that a big part of their lives was coming to an end. The mountains had been their friends, their secret friends, and their quiet partners for so long that leaving them felt like a betrayal. The fall of 1904 was especially beautiful, with colors that seemed brighter than usual. Nora spent hours just looking at the landscape she knew so well, remembering every detail as if she were making a mental archive to look back on in the future. She walked along trails she had walked hundreds of times, went to secret places that no one else knew about, and said goodbye to a part of herself that would always be buried in those mountains. Abigail also had to say goodbye in her own way. She finally burned the last of her papers, keeping only a few things that were very important to her and that she could easily explain if they were ever found. She rearranged the house, gave some furniture and other things to neighbors who needed them, and started the long process of making their lives easier in preparation for the move. During that time, something interesting happened in the cousins' conversations. They started talking about the past in ways they never had before, remembering not the bad things that happened, but the normal things that happened every day. They thought back to the winters they spent together, the summers they spent working in the garden, and the falls they spent gathering what the forest had to offer. They talked about the years before they became who they were, when they were still just two young women trying to get by in a world that wasn't always nice to people who chose to live differently. These talks brought out parts of their personalities that didn't come out very often. They could feel real nostalgia, enjoy simple beauty, and value times of peace and happiness. The fact that they could also do bad things didn't mean that these other parts of their personalities didn't exist. People are full of contradictions, and can keep two completely different parts of themselves in separate parts of their minds. Winter had come again, and the family was cut off from each other, but this time the house felt a little different. They felt like they were in between what they had been and what they would become. They spent the long nights not only in comfortable silence, but also making detailed plans for the future. They talked about possible cities they could move to, what stories they would tell to explain their past, and how they would get new identities without anyone noticing. The years that followed brought about a quiet but deep change in the cousins' lives. The mountain property, which had been the center of their complicated and secret lives for so long, started to change in a big way. The wooden walls that had seen so many things were now only home to normal daily activities. The porch where Nora used to sit and offer calculated hospitality turned into a place to sit and watch the clouds slowly drift over the distant peaks on warm summer afternoons. The change didn't happen all at once, and it wasn't because of one conscious choice. It happened slowly, like the thaw in spring when the snow slowly turns to water. Weeks turned into months, and during that time, no visitor was treated as anything more than a visitor. Months turned into seasons, and during that time, the house was just a house. Eventually, both cousins realized that something deep inside them had changed, not just their outside circumstances. Nora found a kind of peace that she had never known before. She still went on trips through the mountains, but now they had a very different goal. She didn't walk to find hiding places or figure out the best ways to get around. She just wanted to be in nature, feel the sun shining through the trees, and hear the birds singing in the valleys. It was like an invisible weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders, and her steps were lighter than they had been in years. She stopped to look at wildflowers she would have ignored before, sat by streams just to watch the water flow over the stones, and let herself get lost in the simple beauty of the world around her. In the fall of 1905, Nora had an experience on one of these hikes that changed her life forever. She had climbed to one of the highest peaks in the area, a place she knew well but didn't go to often because it was hard to get to. When she finally made it to the top, she was out of breath but happy. The view took away what little breath she had left. The mountains went on and on to the horizon, with waves of green and blue under a sky so clear it looked fake. And at that moment, Nora was alone at the top of the world and felt what she could only call a kind of quiet understanding. The mountains didn't hold any grudges. They just stood there in their eternal beauty, watching everything that happened below. Abigail's journey of change was probably even more complicated and emotional than the others. She kept working on her herb garden, but now each plant only showed how it could help people. She became interested in studying medicinal techniques again. She read old books she had ignored, tried out new combinations, and improved her knowledge in ways that would help other people. It was like she was redeeming all that knowledge by using it for good and getting rid of its bad uses. Abigail had never felt anything like it before, real joy. This was the first time she had really helped someone who was sick, an old farmer with bad joint pain. She hadn't felt this good in years after seeing the man's face light up after he drank the tea she had made, hearing his heartfelt thanks, and knowing that she had used her skills to ease his pain instead of causing it. It was a revelation that changed how she saw herself and her skills in a big way. The cousins started to make real friends with their distant neighbors without even realizing it was happening. These weren't close friends, but real connections between people based on giving and receiving and respect. A family that lived a few miles away started trading vegetables from Abigail's garden for eggs from their chickens. A lone hunter who lived high up in the mountains sometimes gave away venison in exchange for medicine for his back pain. These were simple exchanges that happened all over the country in rural areas, but for Nora and Abigail, they meant something deep. The chance to live in the world like normal people and be part of a common social network. The winter of 1906 was especially bad. The temperatures dropped to dangerously low levels, and the snow piled up so high that it completely blocked the trails. The cousins had a lot of time to think deeply about their lives, the choices they had made, and the path they had taken during this time of extreme isolation. They sat in front of the fireplace every night, wrapped in thick blankets, and talked about things they had never talked about before. They talked about the weight they couldn't see that they carried, and how they would do things differently if they could go back in time. Abigail told me one night that she had been having the same nightmares over and over for years. They woke her up in the middle of the night with a racing heart and breathing that was not normal. She had never talked about this before, keeping her inner struggles completely to herself. But now, in the vulnerable place that winter isolation put her in, she was able to be honest about how much her past actions had hurt her mentally. Nora didn't say anything while Abigail talked. When Abigail was done, Nora just reached out and held her cousin's hand. This was a wordless way of showing that they understood each other and were on the same page. Nora, on the other hand, said that she often thought about paths not taken and other versions of their lives that could have been. It was sad to realize that they were good at so many things that they could have used in completely different ways. Their strategic minds could have helped real businesses, and Abigail's knowledge of plants could have been used only for healing from the start. These were pointless guesses about what could have happened in the past, but asking these questions out loud was part of the process of coming to terms with who they used to be. These talks at night became a way for the cousins to let go of the burden of keeping secrets for so long. They weren't religious confessions or a way to get forgiveness from someone else. They were just two people who had gone through amazing things together and were trying to figure out who they had been and who they were becoming. The only sound besides their low voices was the crackling fire. The snow outside made a white wall that completely separated the inside world from the outside. When spring finally came and melted the snow, showing the brown earth underneath, the cousins came out of that winter changed in small but important ways. It was as if naming their ghosts had taken away some of their power, because there was a lightness between them that hadn't been there before. People did their daily tasks with less stress, conversations went more smoothly, and the quiet times between them were more comfortable, with fewer things left unsaid. That spring, Nora did something that even Abigail didn't expect. She started making detailed maps of the area, not for herself, but to help travelers. She made clear paths, marked safe places to get water, and pointed out places that were dangerous to stay away from at different times of the year. She made a lot of copies of these maps and gave them to anyone who passed by. This was a small way to help keep strangers safe as they crossed those dangerous mountains. It was a way for her to give back and use her extensive knowledge of the area to keep people safe instead of for other things. Abigail watched Nora's project with quiet interest, knowing it was what it was, an attempt to make something good and to balance scales that could never really be balanced. She didn't say anything about it, but it made her want to do something similar in her own area. She started writing down recipes for herbal medicines, making sure to include step-by-step instructions on how to make and use each one in a notebook. She wanted to share this information with others, maybe with a young woman in the area who was interested in healing through plants. As usual, visitors came in the summer, but this time every interaction was real in a way that it hadn't been before. The cousins were just being nice when they offered tired travelers food or water. There were no hidden motives. They were really helpful when they talked to strangers about the weather or the trail conditions. People did notice this change, though. Some of the people who traveled through the area often talked to each other about how the two women who lived on that remote property seemed different, maybe more at ease. An event in the fall of that year put the cousins' changes to the test. A man showed up on the property, looking lost and weak. In the past, this would have set off a certain set of thoughts. But when Nora and Abigail looked at each other, they didn't talk to each other silently like they used to. Instead, they were just tired, deeply tired of who they had been. They gave the man clear directions, sold him some food at a fair price, and sent him on his way with their best wishes for a safe trip. The cousins sat on the porch in silence for a long time after he left. Finally, Abigail said, "It's over," and Nora nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. That part of their lives was really over, not just in theory but also in practice. They had crossed an invisible line and couldn't go back. It was both freeing and sad, the end of a chapter that had defined their lives for so long. The next few months were spent making plans for the future. The cousins knew they would have to leave the mountains eventually, not because they were scared or needed to right away, but because they knew they needed a fresh start to become the people they wanted to be. The mountains held a lot of memories, echoes of who they had been. They needed a place where the past didn't follow them around all the time, where they could just be two women living their lives without the burden of history. They didn't expect it to be so hard to decide to leave the property. For decades, that land had been their home, where they lived through all the ups and downs of their lives. They were familiar with every tree, rock, and turn in the trails around them. It was the only place they really belonged, where they could be themselves without holding back. But they also knew that this sense of belonging was based on a version of themselves that they didn't want to be anymore. Sometimes, to grow, we have to leave behind even the places we love the most. Nora spent the last months of her life on the property writing down everything she knew about the mountains. This included not only maps for travelers, but also detailed descriptions of the plants and animals, notes on the weather, and notes on the area's geology. It was like she was putting decades of knowledge down on paper to leave a legacy that would help people who live in the area in the future. There was something almost compulsive about this project, a need to make sure that all of that knowledge was not lost and that it had some useful purpose. At the same time, Abigail finished her book of herbal remedies. Over the years, the notebook grew to include hundreds of recipes that had been tried and tested. She carefully organized everything by type of illness or symptom. She also made notes on when to harvest each plant for the best potency, how to store ingredients properly, and which combinations to stay away from. It was a labor of love to try to keep traditional knowledge alive as modern medicine spread to even the most remote areas. The seasons went on with their never-ending cycle, each one bringing its own changes. In the late afternoon sun, autumn painted the mountains with colors that seemed impossible, shades of red and gold that seemed to shine with their own light. Winter came with its usual stillness, blanketing everything in snow that made the world look fresh and clean. Spring burst forth with new life, with wildflowers covering the meadows like colorful carpets. Summer brought warmth and plenty, and the days seemed to go on forever, with no sign of darkness. The cousins lived simply back then. They took care of their garden, kept their house in good shape, helped neighbors when they needed it, and were very welcoming to visitors. Their lives were like those of millions of others, in many ways, with daily and seasonal routines. But this simplicity had a depth to it. They were aware of how quickly things could have changed and were grateful for each moment. Nora had gotten into the habit of walking to her favorite mountain spots at dusk, when the sun cast long, dramatic shadows over the valleys. She would stand there taking in the view, committing every detail to memory as if she were making mental files to look at later. These visits had a ritualistic quality to them, like a slow goodbye that made the final separation easier to handle. Abigail spent more time in her garden, where she worked among the plants and talked to them quietly. Anyone who saw it might have thought it was strange, but this one-sided conversation was comforting. The plants didn't judge or ask questions. They just grew and thrived because she took such good care of them. It was like meditation for her, a place where she could let her mind wander without having to deal with hard thoughts all the time. As time went on, both cousins noticed small changes in themselves. It was easier to smile, and sleep was less disturbed. There were times of real happiness that they hadn't felt in years. They hadn't forgotten the past, or stopped caring about it. It just got lighter over time as they built new memories and experiences on top of the old ones. The Appalachian Mountains stayed the same, watching silently as time passed and people changed in their shadow. The rocky peaks still pointed to the sky. The deep valleys still echoed with the sounds of animals, and the morning mist still danced between the slopes like it always did. The mountains didn't keep any secrets from people. They just existed, unchanging and eternal, while generations of people lived their complicated lives in their embrace. So, a story that could have ended in many different ways just faded away into the past. There were no big fights, no shocking truths, and no movie-like ending where justice was done or lessons were learned. Just two women who lived very complicated lives, made choices that haunted them, and eventually found peace in their later years. They were the only ones who knew the whole truth about their lives, and as they got older, they carried that burden with more and more dignity. If the mountains could talk, they would tell stories that would never be told. Some mysteries will never be solved. Some things will never be completely clear. And maybe that's for the best. Not everything needs to be made known. Not every story needs a clear ending. There are times when the best stories are the ones that end with silence, leaving only questions and possibilities hanging in the air, like mist in the mountains at dawn. Thank you for coming along on this dark trip through the mountains and the complicated nature of people. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories that take you into the dark corners of the mind. See you next time.